Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how I like to use, I guess what you would call like browser-based GTO tools. These are sometimes lookup tools. They're sometimes web solvers um, with capabilities to do a lot of what POSolver or other like hardware-based solvers are doing. But these are web based. So I'm highlighting the one that I recommend most often to my cash game students. It's called Poker Scientist. This is different in a few small ways from the more popular programs that I've seen, like GTO Wizard or Odin, that a lot of my students also use, and these are all good programs. I'm just gonna show you the one that I'm the most familiar with personally, and talk a little bit about why I like to use this program instead of some of the other ones that are out there. So these strengths are the strengths of a lot of browser-based solvers or browser-based lookup tools. The primary advantage of using something that's browser-based instead of POSolver is that the hardware requirements on your computer are like lifted essentially. There's almost no requirements. All the storage is done on the cloud, which means you don't have to save a large quantity of sims to have access to a large quantity of sims. And of course, there's the other advantages of, like, if you're someone who travels, if you're a live player and you want to be able to look up something on your phone or on your laptop or in a variety of locations, it's a lot easier for everything to be web-based. Of course, you could address this using POSolver by having a remote server, but that's essentially what some of these companies have done for you by removing the need to have your own remote server and just using their cloud servers to host all the sims or all the data. Poker Scientist in particular has some of these other strengths that I'm talking about. I don't think every tool on the market has these, although some do. The built-in trainer is nice because I like to generally recommend that everyone trains with the same material that they study. Now, that's not always possible, but when you're doing slower study and you're digging into the details of a simulation, it's ideal that the training that you do, which I would recommend doing in a different study session, but when you do train, you're training the same knowledge base, right? You're training the same material, the same sizes, the same scenarios, so that you're not going to randomly find yourself in a spot where the trainer is telling you you've made a mistake, but the solutions that you've been studying during your deep work or your slow study have been telling you something different. So it's always nice to train the same material that you're studying. And these last two things that I mentioned, the simplification tool and runout clusters, I think this is something that's going to be easier to show you because this is some of what's unique to why I like to use Poker Scientist. All right, so here's an example of a simple solution that I'd be reviewing in Poker Scientist. I pulled up their heads up 100 big blind scenario, and this is a single raised pot. So of course, all of the preflop ranges and sizes and everything are already determined because this is a lookup tool. The browser-based tools, generally speaking, I think there's one or two exceptions to this, but generally speaking, they're not solving on the fly. They're referencing material that's already been put together on your behalf. And you can see here, so just right from the very beginning, there have been a lot of sizes offered, and this is the thing that I want to highlight with the simplification tool that I really like to take advantage of. So it's good in simulations to offer a lot of sizes at the beginning, right? Because you want to exhaust all of the possible options that the solver might end up using at equilibrium as part of its resulting strategy. And you wouldn't know if those sizes are useful until you've offered them in some way. So here they've got 4 different lead sizes for a single raise pot. Now, my experience in heads up tells me this isn't necessary. You don't need to be leading in heads up, and here you are. You can see that it's not getting used in this scenario. So we can start with a check, and then you can see the in position strategy for button. Now, right away, there's a lot going on here, and this is what I want to talk about. The in position strategy is being offered what looks like a 20% pot bet, a 40% pot bet, something like testing my, there we go, 80% pot bet. If I hover, it just tells me. So just to double check, 25, 40, 80, and this overbet. So everything's being used a little bit, right? And a lot of times when we look at solutions, this can overwhelm people because yes, they wanted to offer these sizes to figure out what size was best, but now I'm seeing this output and I'm not sure what size is best. So there's methods I've gone through, and I'll talk a little bit about this later in the course, but there's methods I've gone through using POSolver to determine what sizes are preferred, and then gone through this manual process of trimming down those sizes to a practical strategy that you can implement in game. So I would run my own sims in POSolver that offer a bunch of these sizes, and then I would systematically remove those sizes from my strategy if I think that they're not very useful. Now, the thing that I like about this program is that they've built in, actually, it's kind of cut off here on the side, but they've built in this simplifier tool that you maybe noticed on the previous note as well. And what you can do is you can take away sizes and recalculate the strategy without those sizes being offered whatsoever. Now, this is different from hiding the sizes or ignoring them. It's completely removing the option from the tree so that the full strategy adapts around the fact that you're not using those sizes personally. And this is really key. I think this is the best way to simplify. I think it's the way you have to simplify if you want to be accurate. So not just ignoring the overbet that's happening 1.6% of the time, but literally removing it from the strategy and forcing it to recalculate so that the strategy adjusts to all the sizes that are still offered. Now, what you can see here is the EV loss of doing what I'm doing here. So if I was playing this in practice, I wouldn't want to ignore this very, very high frequency bet. I think that by removing that, you could certainly come up with a good strategy, but it wouldn't be my preference to start checking behind at a very, very high frequency. But playing around with this tool, you can see that that's actually quite reasonable. So if I remove the smallest size here, now you can see, okay, a lot of the betting volume has shifted to that 40% size. We lost no EV by doing so. And if you want to further simplify to get rid of this 80% pot bet, you would still lose no EV. But if you wanted to simplify by removing the 40% pot bet, you would lose 0.01. A pretty small sacrifice, but still non-zero. So depending on your personal preference, if you want to play a more merged strategy and high frequency betting is natural to you, I would just go ahead and remove, once again, the 80% bet. And now I can study a extremely simplified tree that is operating within the GTO framework and has lost 0 EV compared to all the previous strategies. So I can go with this 90% bet, 10% checking strategy, and I can continue down the tree and now look at Big Blind's counter strategy and my counter strategy all the way to the river in whatever spot I end up playing, knowing that the flop strategy has been shrunk to something achievable for me. And of course, you can continue to do this on later nodes with the Big Blind raising strategy. Again, they've offered 2 different sizes. You don't need both of them. You don't need to be mixing them. You could remove one of the middle ones. Maybe that's going to be your preference. Simplify to just fold call and bigger raise. You've lost 0. Everything's simpler. You can continue from there. So I really, really like this part of the tool. It saves you a lot of time compared to what you would have to do in POSolver to go through the same process. And that's what I used to do to simplify my own game plan when POSolver was the only tool really on the market to be doing stuff of this nature. So the other feature that I want to talk about quickly is runout clustering. And this is something that, again, a lot of tools have some version of. I know that POSolver has the hotness chart, or I believe that's what it's called, that I've shown before on previous videos, as a way of looking at turns or rivers in a general way rather than a specific way. So I'll show you what I mean just by continuing on with the hand that we were looking at here. A situation we run into quite often is check raising the flop as the big blind, facing a call from in position, and then trying to do our best to build a turn strategy. Just make sure you can see that there. So proceeding from check raise call on the flop, we look at this view turn runouts page. And this is the first piece of data that Poker Scientist gives us when going from the flop to the turn. And I like this quite a lot for general study, not necessarily for analyzing like how should I have played this one hand. But of course, it's a theme in my course. Perhaps you'll notice that I don't like to study in that way almost ever. I like to look at a hand and think, what's my generalized strategy for the situation that this hand gave me trouble with? So if the situation was, we check raised a bluff on queen 10-5, and then in reality, what we got was the 7 of spades on the turn. Well, that's great. If you want to study how to play the 7 of spades turn with your bluffs, you'll learn specifically what to do in that situation for the future. But the broader problem that you are likely having when you ask that question is, how do I continue on turns in general after I've check raised bluffed this flop or this flop category? And that more broad question can be answered by things like looking at how the EVs change on different turns. So something I'm looking at here is, for out of position, what are the favorable turn cards for us? And you can categorize those into a general study for how to play favorable turns. And then which are the turn cards that are not favorable to us? And you can generalize that in a way where you're looking at how do I play unfavorable turns. And when we cluster things in this way, we can learn more quickly a generalized approach to the problem that we're having. So I'll just go through the idea here. Let's start with a turn that I know was blank from looking at those clusters. Now I can see roughly what's happening. Specifically, I can see what's happening on the 3 of hearts turn. And having looked at what other turn cards are functioning similar to the 3, let me just go back and show you that. So looking at similar turn cards, any deuce, any 3, any 4, right? All of these have the in position player, or rather in this case, the out of position player well ahead of the in position player in terms of EV. Similarly on the 7, 8, and not so much these cards here, right? So board pairs are clearly not favorable for the out of position check raise here. You can see the 5, very bad, but the 5 of diamonds, not so bad. The 10, very bad, but the 10 of diamond, the 10 of diamonds doesn't exist. That's what's happening there. So the board pairs are not good, right? The 5 and the 10 are equity switching, I suppose, and those should be studied separately from the deuce, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and perhaps the king and the ace. The jack, the king, and the ace to me are looking like, this is the effect that I was thinking of. So the jack, the king, and the ace, when they're not a diamond, are quite favorable for in position. And this makes sense because they connect with a lot of Broadway floats that might be bet calling the flop that out of position doesn't even flat pre-flop in the first place. But the jack of diamonds specifically, king of diamonds specifically, and the ace of diamonds specifically, these are very good cards for the check raising player. And presumably this is because they improve to a lot of flushes or straights on these cards, and the in position player can't have as many flushes or straights because one of the cards they would need to make those hands just came out on the turn. So being able to differentiate turns in this way is a really useful tool for figuring out, okay, if I want to learn how to play all the different turn combinations that can come, how many different ones do I really need to study? The goal is to simplify, right? The goal is to learn the entire turn follow-through strategy in as few nodes as possible. So I would only be looking at a low card in general, a board pair in general, a straight completer, I guess. So like nine, jack, king, or ace. I would look at one of those. And then I would also look at the diamond versions. So the diamonds are clearly different from the other cards. Maybe not so different on these low cards, although it might be interesting if you're looking for a high level of detail to look at the difference between the 3 of clubs and 3 of diamonds, in addition to the difference between a 3 and a jack. But board pair is a category. Low card that doesn't complete the Broadway is a category. And high card that does complete Broadway is a category. And then diamonds get their own treatment. When we look at it this way, there's however many different possibilities, putting myself on the spot for how many cards are in a deck. But there's only 4 turn clusters that we really need to study. So now we can look at the generated clusters that Poker Scientist uses to describe what I was talking about from the previous grid or the previous visual. So by choosing out of position player or in position player, they have an automatic, let's call it clustering, because that's what they're calling it. They have this clustering tool that takes similar strategies and groups them together. So same idea that the program is differentiating what cards are going to be played the same strategically compared to other cards. So it's interesting. The out of position was quite complicated. It's interesting that the in position player is really only treating an offsuit ace as a separate strategy to all other cards. So I would be curious to look at this, I guess, like simplified differentiation between the two or between the ace and all other cards in the deck. So very quickly, I can learn, okay, when I get check 2, which is a high frequency play on the offsuit ace, I can look roughly at what's happening here. We're only checking back 50%. We're doing a pretty large quantity of medium-sized betting, not much huge betting. We can go back to turn selection, in position player, and change to pretty much any of the other cards. We're going to be checked to quite a bit less often on these cards, so that might be determining what's happening. So here there's a lot of only the small bet, the 17.4 size not being used very much at all. And I do wonder if this is kind of the main difference. So if I look at pretty much any other card, yeah, the in-position player doing a fairly high frequency of the small bet and not so much of the larger betting. So that higher frequency of large betting was happening on the offsuit ace. I would go through a longer process to rule out the possibility that I'm misinterpreting why this is bucketed the way it's bucketed. But again, just knowing that we can simplify how we approach getting checked to and then having a betting opportunity here, this is a pretty complicated situation to find ourselves in, and it's a pretty complicated situation to describe easily just based on a few sims that you've looked at in the past. So the fact that this tool is letting us group strategies together in these more nuanced spots means that we can build heuristics more easily for these nuanced spots and have a sense for, oh, okay, every time I face flop check, raise, turn, check, I know pretty much we always play the same strategy except for this type of card. The out of position clusters were more complicated, and I won't go through everyone right now, but I would aim personally to look through these different clusters to make my own judgment on how different these strategies truly are, and just be mindful of how much extra time it's going to take to try and play, 12 different clusters of strategies after check raising flop. Ideally, we can group together perhaps the different sevens. We can group together perhaps a 10 pairing, a queen pairing. We can take some reasonably similar cards. Like the difference between a deuce 3 and a 4 is probably not very large. So I would be aiming to condense this into fewer strategies to simplify as best as I can, and taking advantage of the different features that this program has to get there. Now, I do want to talk about the weaknesses of Poker Scientist, but also just programs like this, these browser-based tools. The first 2 points here are more broad. This is applicable, I think, to every web lookup tool, web solver. The fixed preflop ranges and the fixed postflop parameters are the big differentiator for me in how we use these tools compared to PO Solver or a preflop solver. But just thinking about the postflop functionality for now, PO Solver lets you examine the difference in how a postflop strategy would play out when you change a preflop range. And this is much harder to do with a tool like Poker Scientist. You can kind of cheat your way into doing it if you're, for example, a 6 max cash player and you're looking at a button versus big blind situation, but you want to figure out how that would change if the opening range was tighter or if both ranges were tighter. You could switch to cutoff. You could switch to hijack versus big blind, right? You could make little tweaks to the pre-solved scenarios to try and figure out the answer to what you're asking. But it's going to be hard to beat the customization aspect of PO Solver. A big part of how I use simulations, and I'm just going to continue to harp on this throughout the course. It's important not to just look at one solution and be satisfied that you know the spot. It's really, really important that you challenge your conclusions, that you change variables, that you look at it from different angles to make sure that the solution you're seeing is reliable. So that's harder to do in this pre-solved environment. It's harder to change bet sizes and see what would happen, to change preflop ranges and see what would happen. And I do think that's a noteworthy weakness, and one of the main reasons why I don't use it as my primary study tool. With Poker Scientist specifically, I found that the MTT library was more limited than the cash game library. I actually think that that's less true now, or at least as I was loading this. So previously, the last time I logged in, I think there was only 10 to 25 big blind stack sizes. Maybe 30 was here. It seems that they've added 40 big blind spots. It's good to see that they're expanding the library. So I will spend some time later looking through this, and the nitty gritty details of, what does every tool have? Which tool would I use for this or that? This is something I'd encourage us to talk about in the Discord community. It's going to be a lot easier to address specific concerns with specific programs, to keep updating, what my recommendations are. This is just at the time of recording. These are my preferences. These are the things that I've noticed from using the tools. But this is obviously going to change. By the time this course launches, it might be changed. By the time this course launches, there might be a new program that I prefer. So this type of analysis is a bit of an ongoing discussion, and I don't want this to be like a permanent knock to one program or a permanent benefit that's exclusive to this program. So with every tool, I want to talk about the common pitfalls that I see in users. Most of this is from my students, but things that I've run into myself as well. Different challenges. This is pretty generic advice, I think, for using any pre-solve tool, or really any solver, is that mimicking a complex output is not the best way to learn from these outputs. The process that I just showed you for simplifying a strategy is so valuable for your practical implementation of anything that you learn in here. So when you see check raising strategy with 3 different sizes, when you see a turn double barrel strategy with 5 different sizes, there is no obligation and there is very often no upside to trying to mimic those outputs. And by simplifying, I don't want anyone to think that they are failing to play true GTO or failing to capture all of the EV that the strategy is showing. It's simply not true. Simpler is almost always better. Simpler within the context of low EV loss and within the context of GTO tools is much, much better. And there's really no reason to feel any obligation to play a more complex strategy than you think that you can keep track of. I'm a big proponent of starting with the simplest possible version of the strategy and only adding complexity when you need it or when you feel comfortable with it. Now, drawing conclusions too rapidly, this is basically, I think that when we have access to thousands, tens of thousands of solutions quite easily, and a lot of the tools, a lot of the browser-based tools let you copy a hand history straight into the solver and just see how well you played it, see if you lost any EV. It's very easy to start building heuristics and to seek patterns at the onset of using those tools. And I want to strongly encourage you to take your time with interpreting these solutions. If you're new to these tools, it's going to take a lot of exposure to different solutions in order to build good, reliable heuristics. And that's part of the reason why I'm going through a lot of my own process with you in this course, so that you can see how much fail-safing there is, how much like challenging my own conclusions there is, and also so that you can compare your own work to the work that I'm doing, and so that you can compare your work to the other course owners in the Discord community to really make sure what it is that you're taking away from these solutions is reliable. It's quite easy to think that you know what's going on in a sim, and then 5-10 minutes later, look at a different part of the sim and realize you know nothing. And very often we go through this process where the first few times you look at a sim, you start thinking like, oh yeah, I've really got it. I'm learning everything so quickly. I understand this game. And then the more you look at, the more you realize you don't understand. So really take your time, be patient with drawing conclusions, and just check with other people, right? Check with your coach, check with your study group, check with your friends. Whatever you can do to verify, it's worth it. These last 2 points that I wrote here, ignoring the aggregate and studying rare nodes, these are again just broad misapplications of solvers, I think. And I will show quickly just the ability to look at aggregate in these tools. So there's the game plan tool. Poker Scientist has this. A lot of the browser programs have the ability to look at specific sims, but also the ability to look at larger reports. And I'm going to do a separate video just dedicated to aggregated reports because I think they're really valuable. But when you're using these tools, looking at 1 or 2 or 3 weird, nuanced situations is not that helpful. But if you can see on the whole how to play your bet sizing for button versus big blind at 100 big blinds, and you can sort it by checking frequency, you can sort it by large bet frequency, there is such a huge amount of data in here. And the patterns that I was talking about taking time to pick up are going to be infinitely faster developed if you use the macro analysis tools that you have available to you rather than the micro analysis tools. Now, once you've narrowed in on something interesting from macro analysis, certainly it's worth going over to the game plan, plugging in the specific spot that you want to look at and figuring out how it works. But ignoring these tools is a huge oversight, I think. And the web-based programs that offer this, I think, are adding a lot of value compared to the ones that don't. So I would, when choosing a browser-based GTO tool, I would look to make sure that you're getting access to aggregated reports. I think for most of the ones that I've mentioned, that is the case. And just to clarify the problem that I have with studying rare nodes, it isn't that we shouldn't study them, and actually the clustering tool that I mentioned before makes studying rare nodes a lot more practical and a lot more productive. But what I see on average from my students is that the stuff that really grabs their attention that they want to solve because it's bothering them are usually these big pots with unusual lines, with unusual bet sizes, and they aren't the types of situations that have big impacts on their win rate. And I'm very often trying to encourage them to stop choosing the hands that they review based on pot size, to stop choosing the hands that they review based on like the emotional weight that they're feeling from those hands. I know it's hard to get past this, and sometimes you do just need to look at it, and maybe using a lookup tool, copying the hand straight in and just getting like a yes or no answer is productive in relieving yourself of that stress. But when you're sitting down for deep study and trying to learn a situation, learn the fundamentals, right? Spend your time on in position c betting, on out of position facing c bet. Look at 3-bet pots facing a flop c bet. Common situations where these tools can give you huge improvements in a relatively short amount of time. Those are the types of spots that benefit your win rate greatly. And this is what I'm going to talk about quickly in best practices. I've already sort of showed these things, but this is the summary of how I want you to use a tool like this to better your game and to better your win rate. So first thing, mass simplification. Take advantage of the capabilities to trim down the tree in a way that you can understand. You probably should, and definitely I encourage a lot of my students who are playing cash games, you definitely should be able to write out in a simple way what your strategy is at the different parts of the game tree. And this is part of the reason we did the evaluation in the way that we did, is to bring your attention to all the different scenarios there are to study, all the different scenarios there are to be aware of, and simplifying all of those nodes into something that you can describe, into something you feel confident about saying, this is how I play that spot, is incredibly useful to give you confidence when playing, and also just to make you more accurate in your execution. So the simplification tools here, and also just using aggregate reports, like using the macro analysis rather than the micro analysis, is going to get you there a lot faster. Turn and river bucketing is the same idea. It's what I just showed you for the check raising spot. When you simplify the way in which you're thinking about how to play turns and how to play rivers, you make it more achievable to have a heuristic or a easily described strategy in a spot that's less common. So this is really the extension beyond how am I simplifying my flop play, my flop bet sizing, my flop defense, moving that into turns, moving that into rivers. I would start with the fundamentals, and I would gradually move to more complex situations. But tools like this allow you to simplify and to build heuristics for all the different nodes if you're using them the right way. And the last thing I wrote here is train what you study. Like I said at the beginning, this tool and a lot of these tools have trainers built in because they're using the same set of sims. You can look, for example, at those single raise pots, and you can even adjust your opponent's playstyle in this particular tool, which I haven't played around with too much, but I do think that's cool. You can take the spots that you were just studying, ideally in the macro analysis, and build a training session where you're forced to sit at a table, you're forced to play game-like scenarios with the exact same information, with the feedback telling you how well you remembered your study. And right in here, just being able to, suppose this is, being able to see the output as you go and tracking your EV loss as you go. Using trainers is something I'm going to cover more extensively in another video. But the main thing that I wanted to highlight for using a tool like this is that it's very important that you try to find a way to study the same information that you're training, or at least use the same background data, the same sims, if at all possible. So that's going to cover it for GTO, browser-based, whatever tools, Poker Scientist.